She arrived when the sun had just begun to rise over a city that did not know her name. The air was cold, the streets were alive, with voices that felt too fast, too sharp, too new. She stood there with a suitcase that held more hope than clothes, and a heart that carried stories from another land. Wind brushed against her face as if to test her strength, and she whispered to herself softly, almost trembling, "I am here. I have made it the airport." Doors slid open and the rush of sound hit her like a wave. The footsteps, the rolling luggage, the hurried goodbyes and hellos, all moved around her. But she stood still, frozen between fear and faith. Her hands shook, but her eyes stayed steady. She looked at the faces passing by, each one belonging to someone who belonged here, someone who fit here, and yet she told herself that one day she too would be one of them. Her journey had not been easy. Plane ticket had cost her years of saving every coin, every small sacrifice, every moment of hunger. And waiting back home, she had spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, dreaming of lights and buildings taller than anything she had ever seen. She dreamed of a life where she did not have to beg for opportunity, where her worth was not questioned by her accent or her past. She wanted to build something that would make her mother proud, something that would make all her pain worth it. As she stepped outside, the air smelled like gasoline and rain. The streets glistened under the morning light, and for a moment she closed her eyes and listened. The hum of cars, the distant sound of laughter, the echo of a world that was moving forward, and she promised herself she would not be left behind. She had no family here, no friends, no safety net, just courage stitched into the seams of her soul. She carried her mother's voice in her memory saying, "My daughter, the world is not kind, but you are stronger than it." She took the first bus she could find, unsure of where it would take her. Sitting by the window, clutching her suitcase, she watched the city move past her glass, reflections of people walking, fast chasing time and dreams. She pressed her forehead against the glass and whispered, "One day, I will not be a stranger here. One day this place will feel like home." Her first room was small, barely big enough to hold her suitcase and her heart. The walls were thin. The nights were loud with sirens and the sounds of a city that never slept. But she did not cry. She sat on the edge of her bed, that first night, staring at the ceiling, and feeling the weight of everything she had left behind, the smell of her mother's cooking, the laughter of her friends, the familiar warmth of belonging. But she told herself that this loneliness was only the beginning, that every great story starts with silence. Before the storm of change, she found work cleaning tables, at a diner where the owner barely looked at her, where the customers spoke words she barely understood. She smiled even when they ignored her. She nodded even when they mocked her accent. And at night, when her feet ached and her hands were raw, she looked in the mirror and said, "This is not where I end. This is where I begin." The city did not care about her dreams, but she cared enough for both. She learned its rhythm, the heartbeat of traffic, whisper of strangers. She began to find beauty in the smallest things, in the sound of laughter, from children on the street, in the way the morning sun touched the skyscrapers, in the way her reflection in a shop window began to look less like a visitor and more like a fighter. Each morning she rose, before dawn, put on her old shoes, and told herself that today she would move one step closer to the life she dreamed of. She did not know how or when, but she knew she would make it. She carried her hope like a torch, through the cold nights, lighting her own path, when no one else believed in her. She had nothing but a suitcase, courage and belief. But sometimes that is all it takes to build a new life in a land that does not yet see your worth. And though she did not know it, then this small, quiet beginning, this girl standing alone at the edge of a new world, was the start of something that would one day change, not just her own destiny, but the heart of the nation that would one day call her its own. The city was not gentle with her. It never slowed down, never waited for her to catch her breath. She woke before the sun, when the streets were still quiet, and the air still heavy with fog. She walked to work with tired eyes and blistered feet. Her body weary, her spirit trembling, but her will unbroken. She faced a world that spoke in sounds she did not yet understand. People spoke fast words, twisted in her ears, until they became noise. But she listened. She repeated them to herself quietly over and over until the strange became familiar, until the language that once rejected her began to bend into her voice at work. She cleaned tables and washed dishes in a small diner that smelled of coffee and burnt bread. The customers rarely saw her face. Their eyes passed over her, as if she were invisible. But she smiled. Anyway, she carried plates heavier than her arms could bear, and dreams larger than the city around her. When the manager shouted, she bowed her head, not out of weakness, but out of wisdom, because she knew her silence was not surrender. It was preparation. She was learning patience. She was learning strength. The nights were the hardest. She returned to her small room, her hands red from soap and water, her back aching, her feet swollen. Yet she did not collapse. She sat by the window and looked at the stars that seemed too far away to care about her. She whispered to them softly, "I was not born to break. I was born to rise," her voice shaking, but steady enough to remind her that the fire inside her was still alive. She believed that pain was not the end, but the beginning, that every struggle was shaping her into someone the world could no longer ignore. There were days when loneliness felt like a second skin, when she ate alone in silence, listening to the hum of the city below, and wondering if anyone would ever know her story. If anyone would ever see the battle she fought quietly every day. She missed home. She missed the warmth of her mother's voice. She missed the feeling of being understood. But she also knew she had come too far to turn back. She told herself that sometimes you must lose everything familiar to find who you truly are. Every morning, she stood in front of the mirror, repeating words of courage in a language that still felt foreign. "You are strong, you are worthy, you are becoming." She learned to translate her pain into purpose, her fear into fuel. She started to save every dollar, even when it meant skipping meals. She studied English after her long shifts, tracing letters on worn paper until her eyes blurred and her head ached. She would fall asleep with open books beside her, as if the words could sink into her dreams and teach her while she slept. People often underestimated her. They saw only a quiet girl with broken English, not the fighter who carried an entire family's hope across oceans. They laughed at her mispronunciations, not knowing each word was a victory. Each sentence a mountain climbed. She never answered back. She simply worked harder. She believed that one day her actions would speak a language louder than any accent could hide. The rejection was constant job. Applications ignored interviews, cut short people telling her she was not qualified. She smiled and thanked them anyway, walking away with her heart heavy, but her resolve heavier. She believed that if the world closed 100 doors, she would build her own. She did not wait for permission. She waited for her moment, and while she waited, she prepared. She learned, she grew. There were nights when she cried quietly into her pillow, not from weakness, but from exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that only comes when you give everything, and still have to give more. She let the tears fall. She let herself feel. Then she wiped her face, looked out the window and whispered, "Again, I was not born to break. I was born to rise." She said it until she believed it. She said it until her tears turned into strength, and slowly something began to change. She started to understand more words. She started to earn the respect of those who once looked down on her. She began to feel the city breathing with her, instead of against her. She was no longer just surviving. She was adapting. She was growing. She was turning every wound into wisdom, and every scar into a story. This was her resilience, not loud, not dramatic, but steady like a heartbeat. Unshaken by the storms around her, she faced rejection and failure. She stumbled, she fell, but she always rose again because deep down she knew she did not come this far to surrender. She came to rise, and every morning she did exactly that. She rose. The days began before the light touched the sky, and ended long after the city fell asleep. She woke to the sound of her alarm, cutting through the silence, her eyes heavy, her body tired, but her heart already moving. She walked through the cold morning streets, clutching a small notebook in her hand. A notebook filled with words she did not yet fully understand, but was determined to master. She whispered them under her breath, while waiting for the bus, her accent wrapping around each syllable like a promise. The diner where she worked smelled of coffee and fatigue. She moved between tables, her steps quiet, her thoughts loud. She cleaned, she served. She smiled, but inside her mind she was always learning. She listened to every conversation around her, turning each phrase into a lesson. She memorized the way customers greeted each other, the rhythm of laughter, the rise and fall of words. She did not just want to speak the language, she wanted to belong to it. She wanted it to become part of her. When the sun fell and the streets emptied, she would return to her small room, with aching hands and sore feet. She would light a small lamp, and open her notebook again, the pages covered in handwriting that looked uncertain, but full of hope. She studied alone, repeating each word softly, until her voice grew steady. She circled meanings, drew pictures beside them, connected ideas across pages. It was not just language. She was learning. It was survival. She knew that knowledge was the key that could open doors. No one else would sometimes. The exhaustion pressed down on her like weight. She wanted to rest, but her dreams would not let her. She told herself that one day she would not have to clean tables forever. One day her words would carry power. One day she would be able to speak without fear. She worked through the night until her eyes blurred, until the letters on the page looked like stars. She whispered, "I am building something even if no one can see it." Yet she saved a little money every week and enrolled in a night class at the community center. It was filled with others, like her, strangers from different corners of the world, all chasing the same light. The teacher spoke slowly, writing on the board in big letters, and she copied every word. Carefully she sat in the front row, afraid to make mistakes, but more afraid of staying silent. She raised her hand, even when her heart raced. She practiced sentences until her voice stopped. Trembling, she began to find pieces of herself in every new word she learned the first time. She understood a full conversation at work. She smiled quietly to herself. It was a small victory, but it felt like the world had opened its door, just a little wider. She started writing small notes to her coworkers, thanking them, helping them, sharing tiny moments of kindness. Her words no longer stumbled. They walked, they began to run. She was no longer invisible. She was learning to speak, to connect, to exist fully. But learning was not just about language. It was about life. She learned how to navigate the city, how to manage her time, how to balance her exhaustion. With ambition, she learned the quiet power of patience, the strength that comes from discipline. She began reading books from the library, books about business, about history, about women who built their dreams from nothing. She carried those stories in her heart, as if they were maps leading her forward. On weekends, she helped other immigrants translate forms and documents. Her new skills becoming a bridge for those who were just beginning. She realized that growth was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared. Every person she helped reminded her of where she had started, of the girl who once stood at the airport, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. Now she was no longer that girl. She was someone becoming. She was someone building the city that once felt too big, now felt like a classroom. Every street, every face, every challenge, teaching her something new. She learned how to trust herself, how to turn doubt into fuel. She no longer feared mistakes, because she understood that failure was just another kind of education. She stopped asking, "What if I can't?" and started whispering, "What if I do?" And slowly, almost quietly, she began to see the change within her. Her words clearer, her eyes brighter, her confidence steady. She was no longer surviving. She was preparing her dreams, no longer distant. They were forming a foundation under her feet. One built from sleepless nights and endless effort. One built from courage and self-belief. She still worked long days, still came home, exhausted, but now her exhaustion carried purpose. She knew she was not just working for today. She was building for tomorrow. She was shaping her destiny, piece by piece, word by word, until the life she imagined began to feel close enough to touch. And though she did not know it yet, every page she filled, every class she attended, every moment she refused to give up, was creating the future that would one day change everything. The day she opened her own business, the morning light felt different, softer, almost sacred. She stood in front of the small storefront, her hands trembling, not from fear but from disbelief. The sign above the door carried her name, a name that once sounded foreign, now glowing proudly in this new land. She turned the key slowly and stepped inside. The air smelled of paint and dreams. The walls were bare, but her heart was full. She had built this from nothing, from long nights and broken English, from faith that refused to die. This was more than a business. It was a story. It was proof that she had not just survived. She had transformed. She remembered every dish she had washed, every rejection, every tear that had fallen quietly into her pillow. And she whispered to herself, "This is for all the nights I thought I would never make it. This is for all the times I was invisible." She did not want wealth. She wanted meaning. She wanted to create a place where others like her could walk in with their heads held high and leave with hope in their hands. The first people she hired were not strangers. They were reflections of who she once was. A young woman from another country, who spoke softly and looked down. When she talked a man with kind eyes, who worked 3 jobs, and still could not catch a break. A mother who carried her baby to interviews, because she had no one to watch him. They came with stories carved in struggle, and hearts filled with quiet strength. She looked at them, and saw herself. She told them, I know what it feels like to start with nothing. But if we stand together, we can build something that matters. The work was hard, but it was different. Now the tiredness in her bones felt like purpose. Every sound, every movement inside her small shop carried rhythm and pride. They laughed. They shared food from their homelands. They taught each other new words, new recipes, new dreams. The shop became a sanctuary, a place where language did not divide, but united, where accents were not mistakes, but music. She made sure everyone who worked there felt seen, heard, and valued. She paid them fairly, even when profit was small. She believed that dignity mattered more than numbers. She believed that success was not measured by how much you kept, but by how much you gave. She taught them skills she once had to learn alone. She encouraged them to take classes, to grow, to dream beyond the walls of her store. She told them, never let anyone make you feel small for where you come from, because the ground you walk on now is yours too. Word began to spread. Customers returned, not just for what she sold, but for how they felt when they entered. There was warmth in the air, a quiet kindness that wrapped around them like light. Her story traveled through whispers, through smiles, through people who said, there is something special about that place. They did not know it was built on sacrifice, on sleepless nights, and the belief that love could build more than walls. It could build futures. Sometimes late at night, when the lights were off, and the streets outside were silent, she would sit behind the counter alone, and think of her mother oceans away. She imagined her smile, imagined her pride. She had promised her she would not just live, she would rise. And now she had. She touched the wooden table in front of her, the one she had bought second-hand, when she had no money, and she whispered thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to every version of herself that had refused to quit. The shop grew slowly like a tree, stretching toward the sun. She opened another one, and then another, each one carrying the same heart, the same purpose. She hired more people from different backgrounds, all connected by the same thread of resilience. She watched them grow, watched them save, watched them send money home to their families. She saw in their joy the reflection of her own beginning. She had once dreamed of belonging. Now she was building belonging. For others she had once prayed for a chance. Now she was giving others that very chance. She understood that success meant nothing if it did not lift others with it. And she carried that truth in every decision she made. And as she stood one evening, outside her store, watching the lights glow against the glass, she realized she had not just created a business. She had created a legacy, a living, breathing reminder that one person's courage can open doors for many, that one woman with nothing but faith and fire can change lives, not through power, but through kindness, through the simple act of giving others the chance to rise, just as she once did. Her story did not spread with noise or fanfare. It moved quietly like wind, through open windows, whispered from one person to another, like a secret too beautiful to keep. People began to talk about the woman who built something out of nothing, the immigrant who smiled through every storm, who lifted others when no one lifted her. Her story became a light in the corners of the city, where hope was scarce, a reminder that no beginning is too small to become something extraordinary. She never planned to be a symbol. She never sought attention. She simply lived her truth, worked with her hands, spoke with her heart, and gave without expecting anything in return. But the world began to notice her strength. They saw the way she treated her workers like family, the way she greeted every customer by name, the way she carried herself with quiet grace. People started to come, not just for her business, but for her spirit. They wanted to feel what she made them, believe that goodness still existed, that dreams were still worth chasing. One day a journalist walked into her shop, drawn by the stories that had begun to circle around town. The writer listened to her speak. Her words, humble, her tone, soft, but behind every sentence, there was weight. There was fire. The article that followed told the story of a woman who arrived with a single suitcase and built a home for many. It spoke of courage and kindness. It spoke of a dream that became a bridge. The newspaper printed her face and her name. And for the first time she saw herself the way others saw her, not as a stranger but as a symbol of what resilience looks like. People from across the city began to visit. Young girls who looked like her stood outside her shop, eyes wide with wonder. Mothers came to thank her for inspiring their daughters. Workers came to tell her that because of her, they no longer felt ashamed of their accents. She listened to every story, every tear, every smile, and she realized that her life had grown beyond her own. She had become her mirror, reflecting hope into others' hearts. She had become proof that one act of courage can echo into countless others. She started speaking at schools and community centers, not as a leader, but as a friend. She told them about her mistakes, about the nights she thought of giving up, about the times she felt invisible and small. She told them that strength is not loud. It is silent. It is the moment you choose to rise again after falling. It is the voice that says, "I will keep going," when no one believes you can. Her words carried warmth and truth, and people listened because they could feel she was not telling a story. She was living it. Her workers began to change too. They stood taller, spoke with more confidence. They started sharing their own dreams, believing that maybe they could do more. Maybe they could build too. She had planted seeds of belief in hearts that had forgotten how to hope. And now those seeds were growing, spreading beyond her walls, into the streets, into the community. And one morning when she walked through her neighborhood, she saw a mural being painted on the side of a building. It was her face, not grand or dramatic, but full of light beneath it. The words, "Hope lives here." She stood in silence, tears filling her eyes. She had once been invisible, unseen, unheard. A woman with an accent and a suitcase. Now she was part of the city's heartbeat, part of its story. She had become unforgettable, not because she sought fame, but because she gave her truth freely and without fear. But even as the city celebrated her, she remained humble. She still arrived early to open her shop, still greeted everyone the same, still believed that the greatest honor was not recognition, but impact. She looked around her and saw people smiling, working, dreaming, and she realized that this was what she had always wanted. Not wealth, not power, but connection. At night, she would sit by her window and look out at the skyline. The same skyline that once felt too far away to reach, now glowing softly before her. She whispered thank you, not to the city, not to fortune, but to the version of herself that refused to give up, that kept going through every fall, through every no, through every lonely night. Because that version of her had built this life piece by piece, breath by breath. She understood now that when you live with purpose, the world will always find you, even if you start invisible. The light inside you will make you unforgettable. She never set out to change a nation. She only wanted to build a life to belong to something greater than her fear, to prove to herself that she could turn pain into purpose. Yet without realizing it, every act of kindness, every ounce of courage began to ripple outward like circles in water, reaching people she would never meet, touching lives she would never know. Her story was not just her own anymore. It had become a thread woven into the fabric of a country that often forgets how it was built. One dream at a time, she gave to her community, not out of abundance, but out of gratitude. She sponsored young immigrants who reminded her of herself, the girl who once stood at an airport, trembling and alone. She helped them learn English, helped them find jobs, helped them believe that they too could belong. She organized food drives and offered free meals to the hungry. She created scholarships for children whose parents worked in silence just to survive. She built not just with her hands, but with her heart. And people felt it. They felt the warmth of her presence, the sincerity of her actions. Her kindness did not make headlines, but it changed neighborhoods, one smile at a time, one helping hand at a time. People began to speak differently about immigrants, not as strangers, not as outsiders, but as builders, as dreamers, as people who give more than they take. She had become living proof that love can be strength, and that resilience can be compassion in disguise. She had shown that true change does not come from grand speeches or positions of power, but from ordinary people doing extraordinary things, quietly, consistently, with love. When the mayor invited her to a ceremony honoring community leaders, she stood on that stage, surrounded by cameras and lights. Yet she did not feel pride. She felt peace because she knew this recognition was not just hers. It belonged to every person who had crossed oceans, Every parent who had sacrificed everything for a better life. Every child who dared to dream beyond their circumstances. She spoke softly to the crowd, her voice trembling but clear. She said, "I came to this country with nothing. But now I realize that nothing can become everything when you give it with love." People listened, not because her words were perfect, but because they were true. They saw in her the reflection of what this country was meant to be. A place where struggle can become strength, where differences become bridges, where love has the power to rebuild what fear tries to destroy. She stood there small in stature, but immense in spirit. And for a moment everyone in that room felt the pulse of something greater than themselves. They felt unity. They felt hope. After that day, she continued her work quietly, unchanged by fame, still walking to her shop, still greeting everyone, with warmth, still believing that kindness was not weakness, but the most powerful form of resistance. She became a mentor to many, teaching them that success without compassion is empty, and that the real measure of a life is how deeply you touch others. Her story began to appear in schools, in documentaries, in conversations across the nation. She inspired new movements for inclusion and empathy. People started volunteering, donating, learning, reaching out across divides. Her courage had ignited something far beyond her small shop, far beyond her city. It had become a symbol, a reminder that the heart of America still beats strongest in those who give even when they have little. Years later, when she walked down the same street where she had once stood with her first suitcase, she saw children playing outside, families laughing, the city alive and familiar. She smiled, knowing she had left her mark, not in stone, not in monuments, but in people and hearts. In the quiet everyday moments, where love still mattered, she had proven that one person's persistence can awaken thousands. That one heart can teach a nation how to heal. She looked up at the flag, waving gently in the wind, and for the first time she felt fully part of it. Not as a guest, not as an outsider, but as a builder of its future. She understood now that changing a country does not mean rewriting its history. It means reminding it of its humanity. She had done that through love, through perseverance, through the unshakable belief that goodness always multiplies. And as the sun set behind the city skyline, she whispered softly to herself, "This was never just my story. This was our story. The story of every soul who came with nothing and gave everything, and in doing so became the heartbeat of a nation, reborn through kindness, through courage, through the endless power of love."